At my grandson's graduation, I found my invitation buried beneath a stack of old grocery ads in my own mailbox 3 weeks after it had been delivered. By then, everyone in my family had already taken smiling photos together without me. I just stood there holding the wrinkled envelope while my daughter-in-law smiled beside my son in pictures posted all over Facebook. If you're here, stay with me until the end of my story. And if you'd like, tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to remember we're not as alone as we think. My name is Helen Whitmore. I'm 71 years old. And until that morning, I still believed family exclusion happened to other people. The envelope felt strangely heavy in my hands. I stood at my kitchen counter beneath the warm yellow light above the sink while the coffee I'd poured 20 minutes earlier sat untouched beside me. My name was written neatly across the front. Helen Whitmore. Not Grandma. Not Nana. Not even Mom. Just Helen Whitmore. The way you might address a distant cousin you only invited out of obligation. I turned the envelope over slowly. The return address belonged to Crestview High School. For a moment I smiled. Luke. My grandson. Graduation day. I had been talking about it for months. I had already picked out my outfit. I had bought him a fountain pen engraved with his initials. I had even written a letter I planned to tuck into his gift box. The smile disappeared when I noticed the postmark. 3 weeks old. 3 entire weeks. I checked it twice. Then a third time. My fingers suddenly felt cold. The kitchen seemed quieter than before. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. A dog barked in the distance. A delivery truck rolled past the front of my house. Ordinary sounds. An ordinary Saturday. But something inside me had already begun to shift. I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation. Cream-colored cardstock. Gold lettering. A small VIP seating card. Reserved family seating. Row B, seat 4. My breath caught. The ceremony was scheduled for that afternoon. I slowly lowered myself into a chair. For a moment, I considered the possibility that the school had mailed it late. Maybe it had gotten lost. Maybe there had been some mistake. But deep down, before my mind could create excuses, my heart already knew. I live in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. I've lived here for 44 years. The same brick house my husband Harold and I bought in 1982. The mailbox sits beneath a maple tree Harold planted when our son Richard was 12 years old. Every morning I check that mailbox. Every single morning. After watering my roses. After feeding the birds. After taking my blood pressure medication. Every morning. Which meant there was only one explanation. Someone had removed the invitation. And someone had put it back. 3 weeks later. I stared at the envelope while my coffee slowly turned cold. Then I reached for my phone. The first Facebook photo appeared immediately. Luke stood in his navy graduation gown. Tall. Handsome. Smiling. Behind him hung giant silver balloons spelling out class of 2026. My son Richard stood beside him. Vanessa stood on his other side. One arm draped proudly across Luke's shoulder. The caption read, "Family means everything on days like this." I swallowed. Then I clicked to the next photo. And the next. And the next. 12 photos. Family photos. Restaurant photos. Parking lot photos. Celebration photos. Not one included me. My sister had commented. Several cousins had commented. Neighbors had commented. Everyone seemed to know about the graduation. Everyone except me. Or perhaps that wasn't true. Perhaps everyone knew. And nobody asked why I wasn't there. That possibility hurt even more. I set my phone face down on the table. The silence inside the kitchen suddenly felt enormous. I looked toward the refrigerator. A drawing Luke made in 3rd grade was still attached with a faded magnet. A stick figure version of me holding his hand. Above it, written in uneven blue letters, "My grandma is my best friend." My vision blurred slightly. I blinked it away. At 71, you learn that crying rarely changes anything. So instead, I sat quietly and remembered. Luke at 8 years old doing math homework at the same kitchen table while I baked chocolate chip cookies. Luke at 10 with a broken wrist sleeping on my couch after the emergency room because Vanessa said hospitals made her anxious. Luke at 13 calling me after his first baseball loss because he didn't want anyone hearing him cry. For years, I had been there. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just consistently. And now someone had hidden me away like an embarrassing detail that no longer belonged in the family picture. My phone buzzed. A text message. Vanessa. I stared at it before opening it. Hope you're resting today, Helen. Big day for Luke. We'll send pictures later. I read the message 3 times. Resting today. As if she had already prepared an explanation for my absence. As if she needed everyone to believe I had chosen not to come. A strange feeling settled over me then. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something heavier. The feeling you get when a puzzle piece finally clicks into place after years of not understanding why the picture never made sense. I looked down at the envelope again. That's when I noticed it. A faint smear of pale pink near the seal. Lipstick. Very faint. Almost invisible. But I knew that shade. Vanessa wore the same pale pink lipstick to every family event. Every Christmas. Every Easter. Every birthday dinner. I stared at the mark for a long time. Long enough for my coffee to go completely cold. Long enough for the kitchen clock to tick through several silent minutes. Long enough for another realization to arrive. This wasn't the first time. The graduation invitation was simply the first thing I could prove. Memories began surfacing. A birthday party, where I was given the wrong start time. A Thanksgiving dinner I supposedly wasn't invited to because everyone was traveling out of town. A baseball banquet where someone texted me the wrong auditorium. At the time, I had accepted every explanation. Because that's what mothers do. That's what grandmothers do. We smooth things over. We protect relationships. We convince ourselves that mistakes are accidents. But sitting there with that invitation in my hand, I found myself asking a question I had avoided for years. What if they weren't accidents? My stomach tightened. I stood up and carried my untouched coffee to the sink. Outside the window, sunlight spilled across the backyard. The wind moved gently through Harold's old rose bushes. Everything looked normal. The world always looks normal when your heart is breaking. I walked down the hallway toward our bedroom. Harold's framed photograph still sat on the dresser. The picture had been taken during our 40th anniversary trip to Maine. He was smiling, one hand tucked into his jacket pocket, looking directly into the camera, looking directly at me. I picked up the frame. You would have noticed this sooner, I whispered. Harold always noticed things. He noticed when someone felt left out at church dinners. He noticed when neighbors needed help carrying groceries. He noticed when people were pretending, especially when people were pretending. A small laugh escaped me. Sud. Tired. Almost embarrassed. Because even now, years after his death, I could hear exactly what he would say. Helen, stop making excuses for people who wouldn't make them for you. The words settled heavily in the room. I placed the photograph back on the dresser. Then I opened my closet. The cream-colored blouse I had chosen for Luke's graduation still hung inside. Pressed. Ready. Waiting. I touched the sleeve. My chest tightened. Nobody had called. That realization struck me suddenly. Not Richard. Not Luke. Not my sister. Not my cousins. Not a single person. The graduation was already underway. And nobody had wondered where I was. The humiliation wasn't that I had missed the ceremony. The humiliation was realizing how easily everyone had continued without me. I sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope resting in my lap. Part of me wanted to stay home, to avoid the embarrassment, to avoid the questions, to avoid seeing photos of a family celebration that apparently didn't include me. Maybe that was exactly what Vanessa expected. Maybe she expected me to disappear quietly, to remain invisible, to make everything easier. The thought stayed with me for several minutes. Then something changed. Not dramatically, not heroically, just quietly. The way a door closes, the way a decision settles. I stood, walked back to the bathroom, adjusted my hair, applied fresh lipstick, fastened the pearl earrings Harold gave me for our 40th anniversary. Then I picked up my purse, the invitation, my car keys, and the gift box containing Luke's engraved fountain pen. If my family had already decided I didn't belong in the picture, maybe it was finally time they saw what happened when I stopped pretending not to notice. I stood in my driveway for nearly 5 minutes before getting into the car. The June sun hung high above the neighborhood, warming the pavement and casting sharp shadows across the lawns. Everything looked ordinary. Mr. Henderson across the street was trimming hedges. A little girl rode her bicycle in slow circles near the corner. Wind chimes tinkled softly from somewhere nearby. The world hadn't changed. Only mine had. I unlocked my silver Honda Accord and slid into the driver's seat. The invitation rested carefully inside my purse beside Luke's graduation gift. For a moment, I simply sat there. My hands rested on the steering wheel. The engine wasn't running. The radio remained off. I stared through the windshield at the maple tree Harold planted almost 30 years ago. Its branches stretched over the mailbox where I'd found the invitation. The mailbox that had faithfully delivered birthday cards, Christmas letters, utility bills, and family photographs for decades. Today, it felt like evidence. I glanced toward the house. The curtains in the kitchen window moved slightly in the breeze. A strange thought crossed my mind. What if I simply stayed home? Nobody expected me there. Apparently, nobody even noticed I wasn't there. I could make myself a sandwich, water the roses, watch an old movie, pretend the day wasn't happening. Would anyone call? Would anyone wonder why Grandma never showed up? The answer arrived faster than I wanted. Probably not. That realization hurt more than the invitation itself. I started the car. The engine hummed softly beneath me. Then I pulled out of the driveway and headed toward Crestview High School. The drive normally took about 25 minutes. That afternoon it felt much longer. At every red light, memories seemed to appear uninvited, one after another, like old photographs, scattered across a table. I remembered Richard's graduation, the year he finished high school. Harold had rented a video camera the size of a small suitcase because he insisted on recording everything. The battery died halfway through the ceremony. Harold spent the rest of the evening apologizing to everyone despite the fact that nobody cared. Richard wore his graduation cap crooked. I fixed it 3 times before he walked onto the football field. He complained every single time. "Mom, stop fussing." I smiled despite myself. Some memories remain warm no matter how much time passes. Back then, family felt simple. Not perfect, just simple. Nobody worried about invitations. Nobody worried about being included. You showed up because you belonged. The memory faded as I merged onto the highway. Traffic moved steadily toward Columbus. Families passed me carrying bouquets and balloons. Several cars displayed graduation decorations taped to windows. One SUV had "Congrats, Emily" painted across the back windshield. Another had streamers attached to the side mirrors. I found myself studying those cars, wondering how many grandparents sat inside, wondering how many of them knew how fortunate they were. My phone buzzed against the center console. My heart jumped. For one foolish second, I thought it might be Luke, or Richard, or anyone. Someone finally noticing. Someone asking where I was. I glanced down at the screen. A pharmacy reminder. Time to refill medication. I laughed softly. The sound surprised me, not because it was funny, because it sounded lonely. I exited the highway and drove through downtown Crestview. The closer I got to the school, the heavier my chest became. The parking lots surrounding the football field were already overflowing. Families streamed toward the gymnasium carrying flowers, gift bags, and signs. I parked near the far edge of the lot, alone, farther away than everyone else. For several moments, I remained inside the car. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. I could still leave. Nobody knew I was here. Nobody would stop me. Nobody would even know. That thought should have made leaving easier. Instead, it made me angry. Not loud. Anger. Not explosive anger. The kind of anger that arrives after sadness has exhausted itself. I reached for the visor mirror. My lipstick had faded during the drive. I carefully applied another layer. Soft mauve. The same shade Harold always liked. "You look elegant without trying too hard," he used to say. The memories settled over me like a blanket, comforting, painful, both at once. I adjusted my pearl earrings, straightened my blouse, picked up my purse, then stepped out into the afternoon heat. The closer I walked toward the gymnasium, the more invisible I felt. Families clustered together everywhere. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Entire groups laughing and taking photographs beneath blue and gold graduation banners. Near the entrance, a grandmother around my age stood surrounded by 3 grandchildren. One little girl handed her a bouquet of daisies. The older woman wiped tears from her eyes while everyone laughed. I looked away, not because I was jealous, because I suddenly realized how desperately I wanted that moment. Not flowers, not attention, just acknowledgement, just belonging. Inside the gymnasium, cool air washed over me. The scent of popcorn, perfume, and polished wood filled the building. Students moved everywhere. Volunteers handed out programs. Teachers directed families toward seating sections. The energy felt joyful, excited, hopeful. I followed the crowd toward the front entrance. A teenage volunteer stood beside a folding table checking names. She smiled politely. "Family seating pass, please." I returned the smile and handed her my cream-colored VIP card. The girl's expression changed, only slightly, but I noticed. She glanced down at her clipboard, then back at the card, then back at the clipboard again. Her forehead wrinkled. Oh, a small word, one syllable, yet something about it made my stomach tighten. She looked uncomfortable. "Is something wrong?" I asked gently. The volunteer shifted her weight. Well, she studied the clipboard again. This seat was canceled earlier this week. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. The sounds around me seemed to fade. Families talking, students laughing, announcements. Over the loudspeaker, everything became distant. "I'm sorry," I asked. The girl pointed to a line on the paper. "Row B, seat 4. She looked genuinely apologetic. "It's marked canceled." Canceled. The word echoed inside my mind. I stared at the card in my hand. The same card I'd just found in my mailbox. The card someone had hidden. The card reserving a seat that apparently no longer existed. My voice remained calm. Years of being a mother taught me that. Years of grief after Harold died taught me even more. "Do you know who canceled it?" The volunteer hesitated. "Usually a parent calls the office." Parent. Not grandparent. Not student. Parent. A strange feeling settled in my chest. The invitation. The missing phone calls. The Facebook photos. Now this. One thing could be explained away. 2 things might be coincidence. 3 things become a pattern. The girl looked embarrassed. "I'm really sorry, ma'am." I offered her a small smile. She wasn't responsible. She was probably 17 years old. Just doing her job. "It's all right." The words came automatically. Women my age learn to say them even when they aren't true. The volunteer pointed toward the upper bleachers. "There are still open seats in the back." Open seats in the back. I nodded, folded the VIP card carefully, placed it back inside my purse, then started climbing the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the one before. Halfway up, I stopped. Not because I was tired, because I saw Luke. He stood near the graduates waiting to enter. Even from a distance, I recognized him instantly. The nervous way he adjusted his sleeves. The slight bounce of his foot when he felt anxious. Some things never change. My heart squeezed painfully. He looked around the gym, scanning faces, searching, looking for someone, looking for me. For one brief moment, hope flickered inside my chest. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe Luke truly expected me there. Then Vanessa appeared beside him. She stepped close, leaned toward him, said something quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I watched Luke nod, then lower his eyes. The hope disappeared, slowly, silently, like air leaving a balloon. I continued climbing until I reached the upper section. Rows and rows away from the family seating area. Rows and rows away from where I had originally belonged. I sat alone beside an empty folding chair. The metal seat felt cold despite the crowded gymnasium. Below me, the reserved family section filled quickly. Parents arranged flowers. Grandparents adjusted cameras. Children waved signs. Laughter echoed across the room. Nobody looked lonely. Except me. I looked down toward the front rows. Richard sat beside Vanessa. They were smiling for photographs, talking with relatives, completely relaxed. Neither one checked a phone. Neither one looked toward the entrance. Neither one seemed concerned about my absence. The realization settled heavily inside me. Hours had passed. The ceremony was beginning, and nobody had called. Not once. Not even Luke. I lowered my eyes toward the invitation resting inside my purse. The edges were wrinkled now, soft from being handled, damaged, hidden, found. A strange symbol of everything I hadn't wanted to see. The principal stepped to the microphone. The crowd erupted into applause. Graduation was about to begin. I folded my hands tightly in my lap. And for the first time that day, I stopped asking whether this had been an accident. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. How long had this been happening? And how many times had I convinced myself not to notice? The graduation ceremony began with the same cheerful music schools have probably used for decades. A familiar instrumental tune drifted through the speakers while rows of graduates filed into the gymnasium. Families stood. Phones rose into the air. Cameras flashed. Applause rolled across the room like distant thunder. I stood too. Not because anyone could see me, not because anyone expected me to, because Luke was my grandson. And regardless of where I sat, regardless of who wanted me there, that fact remained unchanged. When everyone sat down again, I settled back into the cold metal chair and folded my hands in my lap. The invitation rested inside my purse. The edges pressed softly against my fingers, almost like a reminder, or perhaps evidence. Below me, the reserved family section filled completely. I could see Vanessa's pale blue dress from where I sat. The same dress from the Facebook photos. Richard sat beside her. Several relatives occupied the surrounding seats. Everyone appeared comfortable, connected, part of something. I looked around the upper bleachers. Most of the remaining seats belonged to late arrivals, distant relatives, neighbors, friends, people who weren't considered important enough for the front rows. For the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether that's how Vanessa saw me. Not family, just an extra chair, an optional guest, someone whose absence made things easier. The principal stepped to the microphone. More applause, more smiling, more celebration. The ceremony moved forward. Names, awards, scholarships, honor codes, future plans. The entire gym seemed filled with hope. And underneath all that hope sat something else. A quiet ache I couldn't quite shake. About 20 minutes into the ceremony, a woman settled into the seat beside me. She appeared to be around my age. White hair, pink cardigan, a small bouquet resting across her lap. Beautiful day, she whispered. I smiled politely. Yes. She glanced toward the graduates. My granddaughter is down there. The pride in her voice was impossible to miss. I followed her gaze. A blonde girl waved from the floor. The woman immediately waved back. The gesture seemed automatic, natural, the kind of thing family members do, without thinking. My grandson is graduating too, I said. Oh, she smiled warmly. Where's your family sitting? The question wasn't cruel, not even intentional. But for a moment, I couldn't answer. Because I didn't know. Technically, they sat below me, only 30 yards away. Yet somehow they felt much farther. Finally, I offered a small smile. Down front. The woman nodded, then returned her attention to the ceremony. The conversation ended, but the discomfort remained. Sometimes humiliation doesn't arrive through insults. Sometimes it arrives through ordinary questions you suddenly can't answer. My phone vibrated quietly. I glanced down. Another Facebook notification. Vanessa. She had uploaded new photos. Again, while the ceremony was still happening. I stared at the screen. The The first image showed Richard, Vanessa, and several relatives smiling beneath graduation banners. The second showed Luke before the ceremony began. The third showed a group family photo. Every seat filled. Every face smiling. Everyone included. Everyone except me. A comment had already appeared beneath the picture. Beautiful family. Another followed. Luke is lucky to have so much support. Support. The word lingered in my mind. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my purse. For a moment, I focused entirely on the stage. On breathing. On staying present. On not letting bitterness ruin Luke's day. Then I heard laughter. Not loud. Not malicious. Just close enough to catch my attention. A few rows behind me sat two women I vaguely recognized from church events years ago. They weren't speaking to me. In fact, they probably didn't even realize I could hear them. Vanessa said Helen couldn't make it. The first woman sounded sympathetic. Oh. The second lowered her voice. Is she sick? The answer came immediately. Apparently crowds are difficult for her now. I froze. My hands tightened slightly. Crowds are difficult for her now.
The words echoed through my chest.
Not because they were insulting. Because they sounded believable. Reasonable. The kind of lie people accept without question. The kind that quietly rewrites reality. I stared toward the stage while the conversation continued behind me. That's too bad. At least Luke has plenty of family here. Vanessa said Helen prefers staying home these days. I closed my eyes briefly. Prefers staying home. The cruelty wasn't in the lie itself. The cruelty was in how carefully it erased me. Not excluded. Not unwanted. Just absent by choice. The perfect version of events.
No villain.
No conflict. No questions. Only a grandmother who supposedly didn't want to come. For years, I had worried about causing family tension. Meanwhile, someone else had been carefully constructing a story where I removed myself. A much easier story to tell. A much easier story to believe. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself looking directly at Vanessa. She was laughing with a relative. Relaxed. Comfortable.
Confident.
A woman completely certain the narrative belonged to her. Then something unexpected happened. Luke looked up. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Graduates often scan the crowd, searching for familiar faces. But his eyes continued moving. Row after row. Section after section. Looking.
Searching.
My chest tightened. The woman beside me noticed. Your grandson? I nodded. Yes. She smiled. He seems to be looking for someone. The comment landed harder than she intended, because I knew exactly who he was looking for. The same person who was supposedly resting at home. The same person who supposedly disliked crowds. The same person whose seat had mysteriously been canceled. I watched him continue scanning the audience. Something inside me shifted. Not hope. Not exactly. Something closer to sadness. Because if Luke truly expected me here, then he had no idea what had happened. No idea of what story had been told on his behalf. No idea how carefully today's reality had been arranged. The ceremony continued. Student speeches. Scholarship announcements. Academic awards. Applause echoed repeatedly through the gymnasium. But my attention kept drifting elsewhere. To Vanessa. To Richard. To the empty space where truth should have been. At one point, Richard glanced toward the upper bleachers. His eyes moved across the crowd. Briefly.
Casually.
Then stopped. Directly on me. For a second, neither of us moved. The distance between us felt enormous. Not because of the bleachers. Because of everything else. Shock flashed across his face. Then embarrassment. Then something more complicated. Guilt, perhaps. I wasn't sure. What I did know was this. He hadn't expected to see me. Not here. Not today. Not in that seat. Our eyes remained locked for another second. Then Richard gave a small wave. Awkward. Uncomfortable. The sort of wave people give strangers they unexpectedly recognize in public. I returned it.
Slowly.
Politely. Then he turned away. That hurt more than if he'd ignored me entirely, because it confirmed something I had spent years refusing to believe. He knew. Maybe not everything. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to feel uncomfortable. Enough to feel guilty. Not enough to stand up. Not enough to walk over. Not enough to ask why I was sitting alone. The woman beside me noticed the exchange. Your son. I nodded. He looked surprised. I managed a faint smile. Yes.
Surprised.
That was one word for it. The ceremony entered its final section. Graduates lined up. Names prepared. Families shifted forward in anticipation. The energy inside the gym changed immediately.
People sat taller, held phones ready,
Whispered excitedly. And once again, Luke looked up into the crowd. This time his eyes found me almost immediately. The moment lasted only seconds. But I will remember it for the rest of my life. Confusion, recognition, relief. Then confusion again. His expression changed so quickly I could almost see the questions forming behind his eyes.
Grandma?
You're here? Then where were you? Why weren't you with us? Why weren't you downstairs? Why weren't you sitting in the seat that should have belonged to you? The answers sat quietly inside my purse. Folded, wrinkled, waiting. Across the gymnasium, Vanessa followed his line of sight. I watched her turn, watched her search, watched her finally find me sitting high above the crowd. The smile disappeared from her face instantly. Not guilt, not panic. Something colder. Annoyance. The expression lasted only a second before she replaced it with another smile. But I saw it. And once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. Luke continued staring toward me. The confusion remained. The questions remained. For the first time all afternoon, I had the unmistakable feeling that something was beginning to crack. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Like ice thawing beneath the surface of a frozen lake. Nobody else noticed. Nobody else understood. But I did. And judging by the look on Luke's face, he did too. A few minutes later, the announcer called his name. Luke Whitmore. The crowd erupted.
Cheers.
Applause. Whistles. Proud voices filling every corner of the gymnasium. I stood immediately. Just like every other family member. Just like every proud grandmother. I clapped until my palms stung. And while Luke crossed the stage to receive his diploma, I realized something important. For the first time all day, I wasn't wondering whether I belonged there. I did. The real question was why someone had worked so hard to convince everyone else that I didn't. And I was beginning to suspect the answer was much larger than a single graduation ceremony. The applause lasted long after Luke stepped off the stage. Graduation ceremonies always end the same way. Caps tossed into the air. Parents crying. Students laughing. Hundreds of people trying to hold on to a moment they already know is slipping away. Around me, families began gathering their belongings. The woman sitting beside me dabbed at her eyes and smiled. My granddaughter did it. I smiled back. Congratulations. She thanked me and hurried down the bleachers to join her family. Within minutes, the upper section began emptying. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged, exactly where they were expected, exactly who was waiting for them. I remained seated,
Not because I wanted to.
because suddenly I wasn't sure what happened next. The ceremony was over. The truth wasn't. I watched families flood onto the gym floor below. Flowers appeared, gift bags.
Camera flashes.
Teenagers disappeared into oceans of hugs. Everywhere I looked, people were finding each other. Meanwhile, I sat alone in the upper bleachers holding a wrinkled invitation inside my purse. The image felt symbolic somehow. A grandmother physically present, emotionally absent, visible, yet somehow forgotten. I considered leaving. The parking lot would be easier. A quiet drive home. A cup of tea.
No confrontation. No explanations.
No additional pain. Then I saw Luke. He had just broken away from a group of friends. For a moment, he stood near the gym floor scanning the crowd. Searching. The same way he'd searched before the ceremony. His eyes moved from section to section. Then upward.
Toward me.
The instant he found me, he stopped. Completely stopped. People flowed around him. Families hugged him. Someone handed him flowers. Yet Luke didn't move. He simply stared. I knew that look. Confusion. Questions. Concern. Then he started climbing the bleachers. Fast. Ignoring. Everyone calling his name. Ignoring the celebration happening below. Ignoring everything except me. My throat tightened unexpectedly. The closer he came, the younger he looked.
Not 18.
Not a graduate. Just the little boy who used to fall asleep on my couch during thunderstorms. Grandma? His voice carried both relief and confusion. I stood slowly, smoothed the sleeve of his graduation gown, the same way I'd straightened his Little League uniform years ago. You looked very handsome up there. Luke smiled automatically. Then the smile faded. What are you doing up here? Such a simple question. Such a painful one. I looked toward the nearly empty bleachers. Then back at him. Watching you graduate.
He frowned.
No, I mean... His eyes moved around the section. Why weren't you downstairs with everyone? There it was. The question. The one nobody else had asked all day. The one that mattered. For a moment, I considered protecting everyone. Protecting family peace. Protecting Vanessa. Protecting Richard. The way I'd done for years. Then I remembered the invitation. The canceled seat. The Facebook photos. The phone calls that never came. I reached into my purse, pulled out the cream-colored envelope, and handed it to him.
Luke looked down, confused.
I found this morning. He examined the envelope, the invitation, the postmark, then looked back at me. It came today? I shook my head.
No.
His forehead creased. I pointed to the date. It arrived 3 weeks ago. The confusion deepened. What? It was hidden. The noise surrounding us seemed to disappear. Not literally.
People still laughed.
Families still celebrated. But for a moment, all I could hear was silence. Luke stared at the invitation, then at me, then back at the invitation again. His mouth opened slightly.
Closed again.
Hidden. I nodded. In my mailbox.
His face changed.
Not anger. Not yet. Something more complicated. The first uncomfortable realization that two things he believed could not both be true. Because if the invitation had been hidden, then somebody had hidden it. And if somebody had hidden it, then today's events suddenly looked very different. Mom said you couldn't make it. His voice sounded quieter now, smaller somehow. I smiled gently, not because anything was funny, because he deserved kindness, especially right now. I know she did. He stared at me, trying to process everything, trying to fit new information into an old picture. Below us, another family erupted into cheers after taking photographs. The sound felt strangely distant. Grandma,
he stopped.
Started again. Why would somebody hide your invitation? I looked out across the gymnasium. Families gathered everywhere. People who loved each other. People who disappointed each other. People who probably carried secrets nobody else could see. Sometimes families were far more complicated than photographs suggested. I don't know, I answered softly. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. Because even now, I still struggled to understand why. Before Luke could respond, a woman approached us carrying a clipboard. Middle-aged. Professional. A school employee. I recognized her vaguely from previous events. Mrs. Whitmore? I turned. Yes. She smiled politely. I'm Denise Parker from the front office. I nodded. Her expression shifted slightly, almost apologetic. I wanted to speak with you about the seating issue earlier. Luke immediately looked between us. What seating issue? Denise glanced at him, then back at me, clearly unaware she had stepped into something larger. Your reserved family seat. Luke frowned. Grandma had a reserved seat? Denise nodded. Row B. His eyes widened. The front section? Yes. The confusion on Luke's face sharpened instantly. He looked at me, then at Denise, then back again. Then why wasn't she sitting there? Denise hesitated. Only briefly, but long enough for all three of us to feel it. Well, she adjusted the clipboard against her chest. The reservation was canceled earlier this week. Luke's expression hardened slightly. Canceled by who? The question came faster this time, more direct, more serious. Denise looked uncomfortable, the way people look when they realize they're standing inside someone else's family problem. I'm not sure of the exact details. Luke didn't move. Neither
Did I?
Finally, she continued. The office received a phone call. My stomach tightened. I already knew what was coming. Still, hearing it aloud felt different.
Real. Permanent.
A parent called and informed us Mrs. Whitmore wouldn't be attending. Silence. Heavy.
Dense.
Almost physical. Luke stared. The color slowly drained from his face. A parent. Denise nodded. That's what the notes say. Nobody spoke. Around us, graduation celebrations continued. A photographer directed a family into position. A toddler cried near the exit. Someone laughed loudly near the concession stand. Normal life moved forward. Yet inside that small space between the three of us, everything had changed. Luke swallowed.
Hard.
My mother called. Denise immediately realized what she had revealed. Her eyes widened slightly. I really shouldn't. It's okay. My voice came quietly.
Kindly.
She looked relieved, then excused herself and disappeared back into the crowd. Luke didn't move. For several seconds, he simply stood there, holding the invitation, staring at nothing,
Processing.
recalculating, remembering. I recognized the expression because I'd worn it myself earlier that morning. The moment when excuses began collapsing under the weight of facts. Finally, he spoke. So Mom told me you couldn't come. I remained silent. He looked down at the invitation. Then somebody hid this. Silence. Then somebody canceled your seat. More silence. His eyes slowly lifted toward the gym floor below, toward the area where Vanessa stood posing for photographs. She was smiling, laughing, accepting congratulations, completely unaware of the conversation happening above her. Or perhaps not unaware, perhaps confident. Confident enough to believe the truth would never reach us. Luke watched her for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. A memory surfaced. I saw it happen in real time. His eyes narrowed slightly. A distant look entered them, as though another puzzle piece had suddenly fallen into place. Grandma?
His voice had changed.
You know. He hesitated. When I turned 10, I waited. Mom told me you were sick on my birthday. My heart skipped. Luke stared into the distance.
She
said that's why you didn't come. The memory returned immediately. The bowling alley.
The cake.
The wrong date. The explanation I'd accepted. I said nothing. Luke continued thinking. Then, at Thanksgiving, his voice trailed off. And at the baseball banquet, his expression shifted again. Slowly, painfully, the way trust begins cracking. Not from one lie, but from several, one after another. I touched his arm gently. This isn't the time.
He looked at me.
His eyes suddenly looked older, not wiser, just hurt.
No.
His voice was soft. It might be exactly the time. For the first time all afternoon, Luke wasn't looking at me. He was looking through years of memories, and beginning to wonder how many of them were real. Across the gymnasium, Vanessa finally noticed us standing together. Our eyes met. Even from that distance, I recognized the change in her posture. The smile vanished. Only for a second, but it vanished. And for the first time since finding the invitation, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not victory. Simply certainty. The truth had reached Luke. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be quite the same again. For a long moment, neither Luke nor I moved. Around us, the gymnasium buzzed with celebration. Families gathered for photographs. Graduates laughed with friends. Teachers shook hands and accepted thank yous from proud parents. Life continued, but something had changed. I could see it in Luke's face. Not because he suddenly believed the worst about his mother. Good children rarely do. The first reaction isn't anger. It's confusion. A desperate search for another explanation. Another possibility. Another version of reality that hurts less. Luke stared toward the gym floor where Vanessa stood smiling for pictures. She looked exactly the same. The same dress. The same smile. The same polished confidence. Yet suddenly, he was seeing her through different eyes. That realization alone looked painful. Grandma, his voice sounded distant, as though he were speaking while listening to his own memories. Do you remember my 10th birthday? I smiled sadly. The bowling alley. He nodded slowly. My friends were all there.
I
Waited. I remember asking where you were. His eyes lowered. Mom told me you'd gotten sick. Neither of us spoke, because we both knew what really happened. The memory returned with startling clarity. I had spent 2 days baking his favorite chocolate cake. The one with chocolate buttercream frosting and blue decorations, because blue was his favorite color back then. Vanessa called the day before the party. She sounded rushed, apologetic, concerned. The party got moved to Sunday. That was what she told me. One of Luke's friends supposedly had the flu.
plans changed.
These things happen. I believed her.
Of course I did.
Then, 2 days later, I saw photographs. The party had happened exactly when originally planned. The cake sat untouched in my refrigerator for nearly a week. Back then, I convinced myself there must have been some misunderstanding. A communication error. A simple mistake. Now, standing inside that gymnasium, I wasn't so sure anymore. Luke swallowed hard. I thought that was an accident. So did I. The words left my mouth quietly.
Honest.
Simple. Painful. He nodded. Then another memory surfaced. I saw it happen. His eyes drifted again. Towards somewhere years earlier. Thanksgiving. The word barely rose above a whisper. I knew exactly which one.
3 years ago.
The year after Harold died. Vanessa called 2 days before dinner. Her voice sounded sympathetic, gentle, carefully concerned. Helen, everyone decided to travel this year. I remembered standing in my kitchen holding the phone, looking at the turkey I'd already ordered, the pie crusts cooling on the counter, the cranberry sauce recipe Harold loved. I spent Thanksgiving alone, heating leftovers, watching old movies, trying not to think about empty chairs. Then later that evening, Martha Green accidentally posted photographs online. Dinner at Richard's house. Everyone present, including relatives who supposedly weren't even in town. Luke closed his eyes briefly. I remember that. The realization seemed to hurt him. I thought you decided not to come. I looked down at the invitation still resting between us.
No. His jaw tightened.
Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. Across the gymnasium, Vanessa laughed at something one of the relatives said. The sound carried faintly through the crowd. Luke looked toward her, then quickly away, as though he wasn't ready to connect those two versions of reality yet. The mother he loved, and the woman capable of doing these things. Somewhere between those two images, his heart was struggling to find balance. Then another memory arrived. The baseball banquet. Sophomore year. I remembered that one vividly, because I spent 40 minutes sitting in the wrong auditorium, dressed nicely, holding a gift card, waiting, watching strangers celebrate children I didn't know. Someone had texted me the wrong location. By the time I found the correct building, the ceremony was almost over. Vanessa apologized afterward, briefly,
Casually. As though such things happened all the time.
At the time, I accepted it. Now, not so much. Luke rubbed his forehead.
Slowly.
Like someone developing a headache. This keeps happening. The sentence wasn't directed at me. It wasn't really a question either. More like a realization spoken aloud. A fact becoming visible. I nodded. Yes. Silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind that appears when truth enters a room. Eventually Luke spoke again. How many times? I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was, I wasn't entirely sure. Not anymore. Once you begin re-examining old memories, the number grows surprisingly fast. More than I'd like to admit. His eyes softened. Guilt appeared there now. A different kind. The guilt of someone realizing another person's pain had existed right in front of him all along. Why didn't you tell me? The question hurt. Not because he meant it badly. Because I had asked myself the same thing. Why hadn't I told him? Why hadn't I told Richard? Why hadn't I spoken up years ago? I looked around the gymnasium, at the crowds, the balloons, the flowers, the celebrations. Then I answered honestly, because I didn't want you caught in the middle. Luke stared at me. I already am. There was no anger in his voice, only sadness, and perhaps disappointment. Not in me, in the situation, in the realization that family problems don't disappear simply because nobody discusses them. For years, I thought silence protected people. Now I wasn't so sure. A group of graduates hurried past us toward the exit. Several called Luke's name. He waved politely, but didn't leave. That told me more than words could. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was prioritizing answers over comfort. The trait reminded me of Harold. My husband always preferred difficult truths to easy lies. Eventually, Luke looked down at the invitation again. The wrinkled corners, the faded crease near the center, the postmark, evidence. Small, simple, undeniable. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. Does Dad know? I looked toward the gym floor. Richard stood beside Vanessa, smiling in photographs. Yet from this distance, something seemed different. Forced. Almost strained. I thought back to the moment our eyes met earlier. The surprise. The embarrassment. The guilt. My stomach tightened. I don't know. It was the most honest answer I had. Because there are different kinds of knowing. Knowing everything. Knowing part of the truth. Knowing something is wrong but choosing not to ask questions. Sometimes the last kind causes the most damage. Luke followed my gaze. Dad looked surprised when he saw you. Yes. You noticed too? I nodded. Luke stared thoughtfully toward his father. Then something changed again. A new realization. Smaller. But important. He never called you today. The observation hung between us. Neither of us needed to explain it. No. He hadn't. Not Richard. Not anyone. Hours had passed. The ceremony was over. Yet nobody had wondered where I was. Nobody had checked. Nobody had asked. The exclusion itself was painful. The indifference hurt even more. Luke lowered his eyes. The weight of that realization settled visibly across his shoulders. Finally, he looked back at me. I should have noticed. I shook my head immediately. No. His expression argued otherwise. But I continued. Children are supposed to trust their parents. The sentence seemed to strike him deeply, because that was exactly what had happened. He trusted. And trust had filled the gaps where questions should have been. I touched his arm gently. This isn't your fault. He looked away. Toward the gym floor again. Toward Vanessa. Toward Richard. Toward the family photographs still being arranged. Then he spoke quietly. So, if the graduation wasn't an accident. The sentence remained unfinished. It didn't need completion. Because we both understood what came next. If the graduation wasn't an accident, what else wasn't? The thought lingered heavily between us. Down below, Richard suddenly looked up. Our eyes met once again. This time, his expression changed the moment he saw Luke standing beside me. Not just surprise. Concern. Real concern. As though he suddenly understood something important was happening. Something he could no longer ignore. Luke noticed too. His gaze shifted from his father to me, then back again. And for the first time all afternoon, I had the distinct feeling that Richard was no longer merely part of the background. He was part of the story. The question was whether he would finally choose to face it, or continue pretending not to see what had been happening right in front of him for years. Neither of us knew the answer yet. But one thing had become painfully clear. The graduation invitation wasn't the beginning. It was simply the first thread. And now that someone had started pulling it, the entire fabric of our family was beginning to come apart. I didn't stay much longer after that. The gymnasium had become too loud, too crowded, too full of emotions nobody seemed willing to name. Luke walked me down the bleachers himself. We moved slowly through the crowd while graduates and families swirled around us, like a river flowing in every direction at once. Every few feet, someone stopped him. Congratulations. Photos. Handshakes. Future plans. He smiled politely. Answered questions. Then immediately looked back toward me. as if he was afraid I might disappear. The thought broke my heart a little, because for years, disappearing was exactly what someone else had been encouraging.
Quietly, carefully, one event at a time.
Near the exit doors, Luke stopped. Will you come to dinner tonight? The question caught me off guard. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to go, because I wasn't sure I belonged there anymore. Before I could answer, his phone buzzed. A text message. He glanced down. His expression immediately changed. I didn't need to see the screen. I already knew. Vanessa. Mom wants family pictures before everyone leaves. The sentence sounded forced. Luke slipped the phone back into his pocket, then looked at me. Can I stop by tomorrow? I smiled. Of course. He hugged me unexpectedly, right there in the middle of the crowded hallway. Not a polite hug. Not a quick hug. The kind children give when they suddenly realize something important might have been taken for granted. When he stepped away, his eyes looked different. Still confused. Still hurt. But no longer unaware. That mattered. More than he probably realized. I watched him walk back toward the gymnasium. Toward his parents. Toward the celebration. Toward the questions waiting for him. Then I left. The drive home felt quieter than the drive there. The radio remained off. The invitation rested on the passenger seat beside me. Every red light seemed longer. Every memory seemed closer. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sun had begun sinking lower in the sky. Long shadows stretched across the yard. The roses needed watering. The grass needed trimming. Normal life waited patiently, as though nothing had happened. Inside the house, the silence greeted me immediately. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter, removed my shoes, hung my keys on the small hook beside the door. The same routine, the same house, yet everything felt slightly different. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and stood at the sink, looking out toward the backyard, thinking. The invitation sat beside the fruit bowl. Its wrinkled edges caught the fading sunlight. A small piece of paper, a surprisingly large amount of truth.
My phone rang.
I glanced at the screen. Martha Green. I almost smiled. Martha had lived 2 streets away for nearly 30 years. She knew everything. Sometimes before the people involved knew it themselves. I answered. Hello, Martha. The moment she heard my voice, she sighed. A long sigh. The kind people release when they've been holding something in for too long. So. I smiled faintly. So. You went. News traveled fast. Apparently faster than graduation ceremonies ended. Yes. Another pause. Then Martha lowered her voice. The way people do when they're approaching something uncomfortable. Helen, I think there's something you should know. My stomach tightened. I set down the glass. What is it? For a few seconds, all I heard was breathing. Then Martha spoke. Do you remember the book club Vanessa joined last year? Of course I remembered. Vanessa loved that book club. Monthly meetings.
Wine.
Charcuterie boards. Discussions about novels nobody actually seemed to finish reading. I nodded automatically before realizing she couldn't see me. Yes. Martha exhaled again. About 2 months ago, graduation came up. A strange feeling settled into my chest.
Cold. Slow.
Predictable. I leaned against the kitchen counter, waiting. Someone asked whether Luke's grandparents were coming. Silence. Then Martha continued. Vanessa laughed. The image appeared instantly. Vanessa laughing. Not nervous laughter. Not embarrassed laughter. Confident laughter. The kind that signals everyone else should find something amusing too. What did she say? Martha hesitated. Long enough to make me wish she wouldn't. Then she finally answered. She said older people make events emotionally exhausting because everything becomes about accommodating them. The kitchen suddenly felt very still. Outside, a bird landed briefly on the fence before flying away again. Life continued. Yet those words settled heavily inside me. Older people make events emotionally exhausting. I repeated the sentence silently, over and over, trying to understand it.
Trying not to.
Martha kept talking. Most of us didn't really know what to say. I wasn't surprised. Discomfort rarely creates courage. People shift in their seats. Change the subject. Pretend they didn't hear. It's easier. Then Susan asked whether you were coming. My grip tightened around the glass. What did Vanessa say? Martha's answer arrived softly. She said family events were easier when expectations stayed realistic. I closed my eyes, not because I was
Shocked.
because suddenly dozens of moments from the last several years felt different.
Clearer.
As though someone had cleaned fingerprints from a window. Family events were easier when expectations stayed realistic. Translation: don't expect a seat. Don't expect an invitation. Don't expect inclusion. Don't expect to matter. The cruelty wasn't loud. That was what made it effective. Martha continued carefully. Helen, there was something else. Of course there was. There always is. I sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Luke used to do homework. The same table where Harold balanced the checkbook every Sunday evening. What else? Another pause. Then, she said older relatives don't always know when it's time to step back. The words landed harder than everything else. Because now I understood. This wasn't about one graduation. This wasn't about one invitation. It wasn't even about me personally. It was about how Vanessa saw people. Useful. Inconvenient. Relevant. Irrelevant. Present. Disposable. A category system. And apparently I had been moved into the last category years ago. Martha sounded angry now. Genuinely angry. I should have said something.
No.
The answer came automatically. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Maybe someone should have said something. Maybe years ago. Maybe the first time. Maybe before silence became permission. Martha sighed. We all thought she was joking. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because that explanation felt painfully familiar. We all thought. We assumed. We ignored. We minimized. Until one day the pattern became impossible to deny. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening. Ordinary sounds.
Ordinari moments.
Yet my mind kept returning to the same realization. This wasn't accidental. Not the invitation. Not the seat. Not the birthday party. Not Thanksgiving. Not the banquet. Not any of it. Patterns don't happen by accident. They happen by repetition. By intention. By choices made over and over again. My phone buzzed. A text message.
Luke.
I stared at the screen, then opened it. Grandma, can I come by tomorrow after work? I smiled. A genuine smile this time. The first one all day. Of course. 3 dots appeared immediately. Then disappeared. Then returned. Finally, another message arrived. There's something else I need to ask you. I read it twice. Something about those words made my stomach tighten. Questions. More questions. The kind that appear after trust begins cracking. I typed slowly. Whenever you're ready. A few seconds later, his reply appeared. Mom and Dad have been talking about money a lot lately. I stared at the message. Money. The word seemed strangely out of place. Graduation. Invitations. Family exclusion. And now money. Yet somehow, I had the uneasy feeling those things might be connected. More connected than I understood. I looked toward Harold's photograph sitting on the shelf across the room. His smile seemed unchanged.
Steady.
Patient. As though he'd already figured out something I hadn't. And for the first time since finding the invitation, another question entered my mind. What if this was never really about the graduation? What if the graduation was only the symptom, and something much larger had been hiding underneath it all along? I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of the graduation. Not because of Vanessa. Not even because of the invitation. What kept me awake was something much simpler. The feeling that pieces were moving beneath the surface of my family without my knowledge. Like hearing footsteps in another room. Not loud enough to understand. Just loud enough to know someone is there. Around 2 a.m, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea. The house was silent. The kind of silence that only exists after midnight. No traffic.
No lawn mowers. No barking dogs.
Only the occasional creak of an old house settling into itself. Harold used to love this hour. He called it honest time. People stop pretending after midnight, he'd say. Even houses tell the truth. I smiled sadly at the memory, then looked toward the invitation resting beside the fruit bowl. The wrinkled edges seemed more noticeable now, as if every crease represented a question I hadn't asked soon enough. I finally went to bed sometime after 3. By 7, I was awake again. Age has a way of making sleep shorter and worries longer. The next morning felt strangely ordinary. I watered my roses, fed the birds, checked the mailbox. Old habits survive even when trust doesn't. No invitation this time. Only advertisements and a utility bill. I almost laughed. Then I carried everything inside and began making breakfast. Around 10:30, Luke arrived. I saw his pickup truck pull into the driveway from the kitchen window. For a moment, he remained sitting inside, looking down, thinking, the way people do before difficult conversations. Then he got out and walked toward the front door. When I opened it, he smiled, but only slightly. The graduation excitement had faded. Questions remained. Questions have a way of doing that. I made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. The same lunch I'd made him hundreds of times growing up. Some routines survive even when everything else changes. Luke sat at the kitchen counter while I worked. Neither of us spoke much at first. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful, like both of us were trying to organize thoughts too large for immediate conversation. Eventually, I placed the bowls on the table. Luke stared at the invitation still sitting beside the fruit bowl. He hadn't stopped looking at it since arriving. Funny how a single piece of paper can become a symbol. Finally, he spoke. I talked to Dad last night. I sat down slowly. Oh. Luke nodded. He admitted Mom canceled your seat. I wasn't surprised. Something in his face told me there was more. What else? Luke stirred his soup without eating it. The motion seemed automatic. Distracted. He said Mom thought graduation would be less stressful, with fewer people involved. I almost smiled. Stress. Such a useful word. People hide all kinds of things behind it. Control. Exclusion. Selfishness. Manipulation. Everything sounds reasonable once it's labeled stress. Luke looked up. I don't think Dad even believes that anymore. That caught my attention. Not because Richard had changed. Because doubt had finally reached him. Doubt is dangerous. Once it enters a person's mind, it rarely leaves. What makes you say that? Luke hesitated, then shrugged. He looked guilty. The answer felt painfully accurate. I thought about Richard standing below the bleachers. The surprise in his eyes. The awkward wave. The way he couldn't quite look at me. Yes. Guilty seemed like the right word. Luke took a bite of his sandwich. Chewed slowly. Then set it down again. Still distracted. Still thinking. Finally, he said something that changed everything. Mom and Dad have been talking about money a lot lately. The sentence sounded casual. Almost random. Yet immediately, my attention sharpened. Money. Luke nodded. College money. The room suddenly felt quieter. Outside, a breeze moved through the maple tree near the driveway. Inside, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then I asked carefully, what kind of conversations? Luke rubbed the back of his neck, trying to remember. Mom keeps saying things will get easier once the trust fund clears. The spoon paused halfway to my mouth. Trust fund. The words landed heavily, very heavily. I set the spoon down, slowly, calmly. Inside, however, something shifted, because there was only one trust fund connected to Luke. Only one. And Harold and I had created it ourselves. 15 years earlier. Back when Luke was still obsessed with dinosaurs and insisted every plastic toy in the house needed its own name. Harold wanted to guarantee college would never become a burden for him. Education gives people choices, he always said. And choices give people dignity. The trust fund had been his idea. One of his favorite ideas. Luke continued. I overheard them arguing last month. I remained quiet, listening. They thought I was upstairs. His eyes lowered. Mom kept asking how much would be left over after tuition. A strange feeling settled in my chest.
Cold.
Uncomfortable. The kind of feeling that arrives when separate puzzle pieces suddenly begin fitting together. Leftover? Luke nodded. That's what she said. I folded my hands together, trying not to jump to conclusions, trying not to assume, trying not to become the kind of person who sees motives everywhere. Still,
Something.
felt wrong. Very wrong. Luke continued. Dad told her the money wasn't theirs. I looked up immediately. What did she say? His expression darkened slightly. The memory clearly bothered him. She said family money should stay in the family. The irony almost made me laugh.
Family.
Such a beautiful word. Such a useful disguise. I thought about the graduation, the invitation, the canceled seat, the years of subtle exclusion. Then I thought about what Martha had told me. Older people don't know when to step back. Family events are easier when expectations stay realistic. Suddenly another possibility appeared. One I didn't like. Not at all. What if removing me wasn't simply personal? What if it was practical? What if the less influence I had, the easier certain conversations became? Luke watched me carefully. Grandma? I realized I hadn't spoken in several seconds.
Ivy fine.
It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I stood and carried our dishes toward the sink, not because they needed washing, because movement helped me think. Luke followed. There's more. Of course there was. There always is. What? He hesitated, then answered. Mom gets weird whenever Grandpa's name comes up. I stopped, slowly turned around. What do you mean? Luke looked uncomfortable, like someone discussing a subject he'd avoided for years. Whenever Dad talks about Grandpa's estate, he paused. Mom always changes the subject. Interesting. Very interesting. The silence between us stretched. I thought about Harold, about the way he noticed things others missed, about the financial meetings he attended alone during his final years, about paperwork I rarely paid attention to because I trusted him completely. Trust. There was that word again. Always trust. Always assumptions. Always believing people meant well. Perhaps too much. Luke sat back down at the table. The conversation seemed to have exhausted him. Honestly, it had exhausted me too. Not because it answered questions, because it created new ones. The worst questions are always the new ones. Finally, he looked up. Do you think any of this is connected? The graduation, the trust fund, the years of exclusion, the strange comments, the hidden invitation. I wished I knew. I truly did. But the truth was simpler and more frightening. I don't know. Luke nodded slowly. He looked disappointed by the answer.
So was I.
Because uncertainty can be harder than bad news. Bad news at least gives you something solid. Uncertainty leaves you floating. After lunch, Luke helped me water the backyard flowers. The conversation drifted toward college, dorms, classes, future plans, normal things, healthy things. Yet every now and then I caught him staring into the distance, thinking, replaying memories, looking for things he missed. Before leaving, he stopped beside the maple tree near the driveway. The same tree Harold planted decades ago. The same tree standing beside the mailbox. The mailbox where everything had begun. Grandma? Yes. He looked directly at me. I don't think this is really about graduation anymore. The word surprised me. Not because he was wrong. Because he had reached the same conclusion I had. I nodded slowly.
No.
Luke glanced toward the house. Toward the kitchen window. Toward the invitation, waiting inside. Then back at me. I think Grandpa knew something. After he drove away, I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the maple leaves, thinking about Harold, thinking about the trust fund, thinking about all the conversations I wasn't part of. Then I walked inside, picked up the phone, and called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 6 months. Martin Bell, Harold's longtime financial advisor, because if there was something hiding underneath all of this, I had a feeling Harold might have left clues behind. And for the first time since finding the invitation, I wasn't just looking backward anymore. I was about to start looking for answers. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely calm. Not happy, Not relieved. Simply focused. For nearly a week, I had been reacting. Finding the invitation. Attending the graduation. Learning about the canceled seat. Listening to Martha. Watching Luke struggle with uncomfortable truths. Everything had happened to me. Now, for the first time, I was going to do something myself. I arrived at Whitmore and Bell Financial shortly after 10 o'clock. The office occupied the third floor of a brick building in downtown Columbus. Harold loved that building. He always said it looked trustworthy.
Solid.
The kind of place that wouldn't disappear overnight. I parked in the visitor lot and sat in my car for a moment. The June morning felt warm already. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Normal lives. Normal worries. I wondered how many of them were carrying family secrets too. Probably more than anyone realized. Eventually, I stepped inside. The receptionist looked up immediately. Recognition crossed her face. Mrs. Whitmore. I smiled. It's been a while. She stood. Mr. Bell will be very happy to see you. That surprised me. Not because Martin Bell wasn't kind. Because 6 months had passed since our last meeting. After Harold died, I avoided financial offices whenever possible. Too many memories. Too many reminders. Too many empty chairs. A few minutes later, Martin appeared in the hallway. His silver hair had grown thinner around the temples. His glasses looked slightly stronger than before, but the warmth remained unchanged. Helen. His voice carried genuine affection. We shook hands. Then he led me toward a conference room overlooking downtown. The same room where Harold and I had signed trust documents years ago. The same room where we planned Luke's future. For a moment, the memories hit unexpectedly hard. Harold sitting beside me, his reading glasses low on his nose, asking questions I never would have thought to ask. Always prepared, always paying attention. Martin seemed to notice. His expression softened. You miss him. It wasn't a question. I smiled sadly. Every day. Martin nodded, then waited, patiently, the way good listeners do. Eventually I reached into my purse, removed the graduation invitation, placed it gently on the table. Martin glanced at it, then at me. I assume you're not here about graduation.
No.
His eyes sharpened slightly. Then what are you here about? I took a slow breath. The trust. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Martin folded his hands.
Carefully.
Professionally.
All.
Right. I appreciated that he didn't immediately ask why. He simply waited, giving me room to explain.
So I did.
Not every detail. Not the entire story. Just enough. The invitation. The exclusion. Luke's comments. The conversations about money. The phrase trust fund clears. Martin listened without interrupting. His expression revealed very little, which probably explained why he had survived decades in finance. When I finally finished, silence settled across the room. He leaned back slightly, thinking, then opened a file drawer beside the conference table. Several folders emerged. One of them carried Harold's name. My chest tightened immediately. I hadn't seen Harold's handwriting in months. Martin opened the folder carefully, then looked directly at me. Helen. His voice sounded different now, more serious. There are a few things you should know. My stomach tightened. I nodded. He turned several pages, then stopped. The educational trust remains exactly as Harold designed it. I listened carefully. All tuition payments are made directly to the university. That sounded familiar. Expected. Room and board. Directly approved. I nodded. What about reimbursements? Martin shook his head.
No.
What about family access? Again, he shook his head.
No.
A strange sense of relief moved through me. Not because of the money, because of what it meant. The trust wasn't vulnerable. At least not easily. Martin continued. No one can access those funds except through the structure Harold established. I looked down at the paperwork. The pages seemed ordinary. Numbers. Signatures. Legal language. Yet hidden inside them was one of Harold's final acts of protection. Protection for Luke. Protection I was only now beginning to appreciate. Then Martin said something unexpected. Harold worried. I looked up immediately. Worried. Martin hesitated. Only briefly, but enough. Enough to tell me this conversation mattered. Several years before he passed away. My pulse quickened. He mentioned concerns about family dynamics. Family dynamics. The phrase sounded harmless, professional,
Polite.
which usually meant the reality underneath wasn't. What kind of concerns? Martin removed his glasses, set them on the table, then answered. He felt certain people viewed family relationships transactionally. For a moment, I didn't understand. Then I did. Transactionally. The word settled heavily inside me. Not family as connection. Family as opportunity. Family as leverage. Family as access. Family as usefulness. The description fit far too well. Vanessa. Martin didn't immediately answer. Financial advisors are careful people. Very careful. Finally he spoke. Harold never mentioned names. That was answer enough. We both knew. Neither of us needed confirmation. I stared at the documents. The room felt strangely smaller now, as though pieces of a puzzle I'd spent years avoiding were suddenly assembling themselves. Martin leaned forward. There was something else. Of course there was. There always seemed to be something else lately. What? His voice lowered slightly. Harold worried you were too kind. I blinked. The statement caught me completely off guard. Too kind? Martin smiled sadly. He said you always gave people the benefit of the doubt. The words hit harder than I expected. Because they were true. Painfully true. I had spent years explaining things away. Accidents. Misunderstandings. Oversights. Poor communication. Bad timing. I had transformed every wound into something easier to accept. Not because I was foolish. Because I wanted peace. The difference matters. Or, at least I used to think it did. Martin slid another document toward me. The trust agreement. Harold's signature at the bottom.
Strong. Confident.
Steady. I traced the edge of the page with my fingertips. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice. Helen. Simple. Patient. Loving. The way he always sounded when he was trying to help me see something difficult. Martin interrupted my thoughts gently. There's approximately $187,000 remaining. I looked up. The number itself didn't matter. The reaction to it did. Because suddenly I understood something. If Vanessa believed money would become available, if she believed funds might eventually pass through the family, if she viewed relationships transactionally, then the graduation might not have been the cause. It might have been the symptom. A symptom of something larger. Something older. Something connected to influence. Access.
Control.
The realization left me unsettled. Not because it proved anything. Because it made too much sense. When our meeting ended, Martin walked me toward the elevator. Just before the doors opened, he spoke again. One final thought. One final piece. Harold trusted you completely. I smiled. I know. Martin shook his head.
No.
His expression remained serious. I don't think you do. The elevator door stayed open. Waiting. He trusted your heart. The sentence lingered. He just worried other people might use it against you. Neither of us spoke after that. There was nothing left to say. The elevator carried me down 3 floors. Yet my thoughts remained upstairs. With Harold. With Martin. With the trust. With the possibility that someone had been quietly taking advantage of my silence for years. Outside, dark clouds had begun gathering above downtown. The air felt heavy. Storm weather. I sat inside my car without starting it, thinking. Then my phone buzzed. A text message. Richard. My stomach tightened immediately. The first direct message from him since graduation. I opened it. Mom, can we talk? Just 4 words. Nothing more. Yet somehow they carried more weight than entire conversations. I stared at the screen, reading it twice. Then a 3rd time. Because for the first time, since all this began, Richard wasn't asking me to move on. He wasn't offering excuses. He wasn't defending Vanessa. He was asking to talk. And deep down, I had a feeling he was finally ready to tell me something he should have said years ago. I didn't answer Richard's text immediately. Not because I wanted to punish him. Not because I wanted him to worry. I simply needed time. Time to sit with everything I had learned. Time to think about Harold. Time to decide whether I was ready to hear whatever Richard finally wanted to say. For years, I had imagined this conversation. Not specifically, not in detail, but in spirit. Every mother eventually reaches a moment when she wonders whether her child truly sees her. Not as mom. Not as the person who always forgives. Not as the person who always remains available. But as a human being. A person capable of being hurt. Capable of being disappointed. Capable of breaking. By the time I arrived home from Martin's office, the afternoon sky had darkened considerably. Rain clouds hung low over the neighborhood. The air smelled like an approaching storm. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter, set the trust documents beside the invitation, then stood there looking at both. Two pieces of paper. One representing Luke's future, the other representing my place in the family. Strangely enough, both seemed connected now.
My phone buzzed again.
Richard. Please, Mom.
Just that. Please, Mom. No excuses. No explanations.
No attempt to soften things. Something about that affected me more than I expected. I stared at the screen, then finally typed, "Come by around 6. His reply arrived almost immediately. "Thank you." The storm arrived shortly after 5. Rain tapped against the windows. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the trees. The house felt smaller during storms ever since Harold died. He always loved bad weather. He'd sit on the porch with coffee and insist there was nothing more relaxing than watching rain.
I never understood that.
Now I missed it. At exactly 6 o'clock, Richard's truck pulled into the driveway. Punctual. That alone told me he was nervous. Richard has always arrived early when something mattered, late when it didn't. Some habits begin in childhood and never leave. I opened the door before he could knock. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked tired, older than 42. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper. The confidence he usually carried was missing.
Good.
Not because I wanted him uncomfortable, because comfortable people rarely tell the truth. Mom. The old word slipped out automatically.
Despite everything.
He smiled faintly, then followed me into the kitchen. The familiar room seemed strangely formal now, as though both of us understood we weren't here for small talk. I made coffee. He sat at the table. The same seat he'd occupied as a teenager doing homework. The same seat where Harold taught him how to balance a checkbook. The same seat where he once announced he wanted to marry Vanessa. Life moves in circles sometimes. Painfully so. Eventually, I placed a mug in front of him. Richard wrapped both hands around it. Not drinking, just holding it, like an anchor. For several moments, only the rain spoke. Finally, he looked up. I don't know where to start. I almost smiled. Try the truth. The answer landed harder than I intended. Richard looked down immediately.
Guilt.
There it was again. Everywhere lately. The room seemed full of it. Finally, he nodded. Okay. Another pause. Then, I should have called you. A simple sentence. Yet, hearing it mattered. Not because it fixed anything. Because it acknowledged something. The absence. The silence. The fact that nobody checked. I know. Richard swallowed. His eyes drifted toward the invitation lying on the counter. He recognized it immediately. Of course he did. The sight seemed to make him even more uncomfortable. I didn't know she hid it. I believed him. Oddly enough, that wasn't the problem anymore. Because suddenly a different question mattered more. What did you know? The room became very still. Outside, rain continued striking the windows. Richard stared into his coffee, thinking, choosing words, avoiding words, the way people do when honesty threatens something important. Finally, he spoke. I knew Vanessa didn't like having you involved in everything. I leaned back slightly. The statement didn't surprise me. Its honesty did. Richard continued. At first it seemed small. His voice sounded tired. Little comments. I waited. Things like. He hesitated. Boundaries. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because that word again. Boundaries. Stress. Complicated. People hide behind the same vocabulary over and over. She said every family needs boundaries. Richard shook his head. I thought she meant healthy boundaries. Neither of us spoke, because we both understood the difference. Healthy boundaries create space. Control creates distance. They look similar from far away, very different up close. Richard stared toward the rain-covered window. Then it became other things.
My
Chest tightened slightly. What things? His jaw moved. Once.
twice.
As though speaking physically hurt. The Thanksgiving dinner. I remained silent. I knew she lied. There it was. The first real confession. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just devastatingly honest. Richard continued. I found out 2 days before. I closed my eyes briefly. 2 days. He knew. 2 days. And said nothing. The pain wasn't sharp. Sharp pain fades quickly. This felt heavier. Slower. A weight settling quietly across years of memory. Why? The question came out softer than I expected. Richard looked miserable. Truly miserable. Because we argued about it. I waited. Vanessa said you would make things awkward. The words hung in the air.
Ugly. Small.
Pull. She said you were still grieving Dad. I stared at him. Still grieving Dad. As though grief made me inconvenient. As though widowhood made me exhausting. Richard rubbed both hands across his face. I knew it wasn't right. Yet you let it happen. The sentence landed.
Hard.
He nodded. Slowly. Painfully. Yes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing to say. Because there was too much. Eventually Richard looked at me. His eyes glistened slightly. The way they used to when he was little, and trying not to cry. Mom. His voice cracked. Only slightly. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal. There it was. The real problem. Not cruelty. Weakness. Weakness is often more damaging. Cruel people expect resistance. Weak people quietly allow damage to continue. Richard stared down at his hands. The birthday party. Another confession. I knew about that too. I closed my eyes again. Not because I was surprised. Because hearing it out loud made it real. I told myself Vanessa probably forgot. The rain intensified outside. Thunder rolled overhead. Richard kept talking. The words seemed unstoppable now. Years of silence finally breaking. The baseball banquet. His voice lowered. The Christmas dinner. Another pause. The wrong directions. My throat tightened. Memory after memory. Moment after moment. Not accidents. Not misunderstandings. Choices. Small choices. Repeated enough times to become a pattern. Richard looked devastated now. I never thought about how it felt for you. That sentence hurt more than everything else. Not because it was cruel. Because it was true. I looked around the kitchen. At the family photographs. At Harold's old coffee mug hanging near the stove. At the refrigerator drawing Luke made years ago. Evidence of a life spent loving people. Then I looked back at my son. I know. The honesty seemed to wound him. Good. Not because I wanted revenge. Because sometimes pain is the only thing that finally reaches people. Richard stared at the table for a long time. Then spoke again. More quietly. I think Dad saw it. The statement surprised me.
What?
He nodded slowly. I think Dad noticed before I did. I thought about Martin. About the trust. About Harold's concerns. My stomach tightened. Richard continued. A few years before he died, he asked me something. I waited. He asked whether I was paying attention. The room felt smaller suddenly. What did you tell him? Richard laughed bitterly. One short laugh. No humor in it. I told him everything was fine. Silence. Then, he looked disappointed. The confession seemed to cost him something. Because for the first time, Richard wasn't simply confronting Vanessa's behavior. He was confronting himself. The son who looked away. The husband who chose comfort. The father who missed what was happening right in front of him. Outside, the storm finally began easing. Rain softened. Thunder faded. The house grew quieter. Eventually, Richard looked toward me again.
Mom.
Yes. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I think I've failed you. The sentence remained suspended between us.
Heavy. Honest.
Painfully overdue. And for the first time since this entire story began, I realized something important. Richard wasn't the villain. Vanessa wasn't the only problem. The real damage had happened because one person manipulated and another person chose not to see it. The question now wasn't whether Richard felt guilty. He clearly did. The question was whether guilt would finally become courage. Because there was still one person who hadn't told the truth. And sooner or later, Vanessa would have to face it. 3 days after Richard came to my house, Luke called. Grandma. His voice sounded tense.
Tired.
The way people sound when they haven't been sleeping well. Yes, sweetheart. There was a pause. Then, Dad wants everyone to have dinner together. I looked out the kitchen window. The maple trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We both understood what this dinner really meant. Not a celebration. Not a family gathering. A reckoning. When? Sunday. Another pause. Mom agreed. That surprised me. Not because Vanessa wanted peace. Because people rarely volunteer for conversations they can't control. Unless they believe they still can. I thanked Luke and hung up. Then spent the next several days wondering whether I should go. Part of me wanted to decline. Part of me wanted to avoid the entire thing. I was tired. Tired of explanations. Tired of discoveries. Tired of realizing how many years I had spent apologizing for taking up space in my own family. Yet another part of me knew something important. If I didn't go, nothing would change. Silence had already cost enough. Sunday arrived warm and humid. The kind of Ohio summer evening where the air feels heavy even after sunset. I baked a blueberry pie. Not because anyone deserved it. Because baking calmed me. The familiar routine steadied my thoughts. By 6 o'clock, I found myself standing on Richard's front porch. The same porch where Luke used to race barefoot toward me whenever I visited. The same porch where Harold grilled hamburgers every 4th of July. The same porch that somehow felt unfamiliar now. Vanessa opened the door. She wore cream-colored slacks and a pale sweater despite the heat. Everything about her appearance looked carefully arranged, controlled,
Polished.
as though she had spent extra time preparing for this evening. Helen. Her smile appeared immediately.
Practiced.
Measured. Almost perfect. I'm glad you came. I handed her the pie. It seemed rude not to. Something flickered across her face.
Gone almost instantly.
But I saw it. The same way I had seen the irritation during graduation. The same way I had seen the annoyance when Luke found me. In the bleachers. She stepped aside. I entered. The dining room looked beautiful. Too beautiful. Linen napkins. Polished wine glasses. Fresh flowers. The table felt less like a family dinner and more like a stage. A place where everyone had already rehearsed their lines. Richard stood near the kitchen island. The moment he saw me, guilt crossed his face. Quickly hidden, but visible.
Luke sat at the table, relieved.
That was the first emotion I recognized. Relief. As though he had been carrying the weight of this dinner all week. I sat beside him. Vanessa noticed. Immediately. The tiny tightening around her eyes gave it away. Interesting. Even now, small things mattered. Control often reveals itself through small things. Dinner began awkwardly. Conversation drifted toward college, dorm rooms, meal plans, football season, safe subjects. Everyone pretending the real conversation wasn't waiting underneath. Forks clinked against plates. Ice shifted inside water glasses. The silence between topics grew longer. Eventually, Vanessa set down her wine glass. There it was. The moment. The room seemed to sense it too. Even Luke straightened slightly. Vanessa folded her hands, then looked directly at me. I think we should clear the air. The sentence sounded rehearsed. I smiled politely. I agree. Richard immediately looked down at his plate. That alone told me plenty. Vanessa inhaled slowly.
Carefully.
Preparing. I never intended for you to feel excluded. The word arrived exactly as expected. Excluded. Not hidden. Not erased. Not removed. Excluded. A softer word. A safer word. I remained silent, letting her continue. Graduation became very stressful. There was that word again. Stress. Always stress. The universal excuse. She continued. Between planning, relatives, schedules, and college preparation. Her voice remained calm, reasonable, measured. Anyone walking into the room halfway through would probably believe her. That was part of Vanessa's gift. She understood appearances very well. I thought simplifying things would help Luke. Luke looked up immediately. The statement clearly bothered him. Before he could respond, Vanessa continued. I was trying to protect everyone from unnecessary tension.
Protect.
Another interesting word. People often describe control as protection. The room remained quiet. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, then set it down. What tension? The question landed gently.
No accusation. No anger.
Just curiosity. Vanessa hesitated. Only briefly, then answered. Family expectations. I almost smiled. Not because the answer was convincing, because it wasn't. At all. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Luke stared openly now. Watching. Listening. Learning. Vanessa continued. When families become large, boundaries matter. Boundaries. Another familiar word. The same vocabulary. The same carefully chosen language. Always sounding healthy. Always sounding reasonable. I glanced toward Richard. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. Interesting. Very interesting. I looked back at Vanessa. So, hiding my invitation was a boundary? The room froze.
Completely.
Even the air felt different. Vanessa blinked.
Once. Twice.
The first real crack all evening. I didn't hide your invitation. The answer came too quickly. Too automatically. Like a reflex. Luke immediately spoke. The school confirmed someone canceled Grandma's seat. Silence. Vanessa turned toward him. Patient. Controlled. The expression mothers often use when they want their children to stop asking inconvenient questions. I explained that already.
No.
Luke's voice remained calm. Much calmer than I expected. You explained it poorly. For a moment, pride moved unexpectedly through me. Harold would have liked that answer. Vanessa shifted slightly. The control she normally carried seemed less secure now. She turned back toward me. Helen, honestly, I think this entire situation has been exaggerated. There it was. Another strategy. Minimize. Reduce. Redefine. If reality becomes smaller, accountability often disappears with it. I folded my napkin carefully, then looked directly at her. When did I exaggerate? The question lingered. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out, because the truth was simple. I hadn't exaggerated. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made public accusations. I hadn't attacked anyone.
I
simply showed up. Sometimes reality doesn't need help. Eventually, Vanessa sighed. The first sign of genuine frustration all evening. Not guilt. Frustration. A very important difference. Then she said something unexpected. Something she clearly didn't intend to reveal. I just thought things were easier when you stayed in the background. Silence. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words hung above the table.
Heavy. Permanent.
Irretrievable. Vanessa seemed to realize what she'd said only after hearing it herself. Too late. Much too late. Across from me, Luke stared. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The room felt smaller, as though the walls had moved closer. I looked at Vanessa. Really looked at her. For the first time in 20 years. Not as my daughter-in-law. Not as Luke's mother. Not as family. Simply as a person. And suddenly, everything made sense. The birthday party. Thanksgiving. The banquet. The invitation. The graduation. The comments Martha overheard. Older people make things difficult. Older people don't know when to step back. Family expectations. Boundaries. Stress. All different versions of the same belief. Vanessa didn't want conflict. She wanted convenience. and inconvenient people belong in the background. The realization felt strangely calm. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just clear. Luke finally broke the silence. What does that even mean? His voice sounded hurt. More hurt than angry. That seemed to affect Vanessa more than anything else. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Real uncertainty. Not because of me. Because of him. Because the person she most wanted to influence was no longer accepting her explanations automatically. Vanessa looked toward Richard, seeking support, backup, confirmation. Instead, Richard remained silent. That silence spoke louder than any speech. She looked back at me, then at Luke, then at the table. The control she normally carried had begun slipping away. Not because anyone attacked her, because the truth had finally been spoken out loud. And once certain truths enter a room, they never really leave. Nobody touched dessert that night. The blueberry pie remained untouched in the center of the table. A perfect circle of silence. A reminder that some appetites disappear when illusions finally break. As I sat there looking at the pie, I realized something important. This dinner wasn't the ending. It was the moment the masks finally started falling. And once they started falling, there would be no putting them back on. Nobody called the next morning. Not Vanessa. Not Richard. Not even Luke. For the first time since the graduation, I was grateful for the silence. The dinner had exhausted me. Not physically. Emotionally. There is something strangely draining about hearing a truth you've known for years finally spoken out loud. You stop spending energy wondering whether you're imagining things, and start dealing with the reality instead. I spent most of Monday in the garden. The roses needed pruning. Several weeds had worked their way into the flower beds. The work was familiar, predictable, unlike people. Around noon, I found myself standing beside the maple tree near the mailbox. The same tree Harold planted decades earlier. The same tree that had witnessed birthdays, holidays, graduations, and ordinary afternoons. It occurred to me how strange life can be. A tree quietly grows, year after year, without drama, without manipulation, without needing attention. Meanwhile, people complicate everything. The thought almost made me smile. Almost. My phone buzzed.
Luke.
Are you home? I typed back. Always. 20 minutes later, his truck rolled into the driveway. He looked tired again. More tired than a 19-year-old should. College worries. Family problems. Disappointment. Those things age people faster than time. I made iced tea. He sat at the kitchen table. For a while, neither of us mentioned the dinner. The silence felt respectful. Necessary. Eventually, Luke spoke. Mom's angry. I nodded. That wasn't surprising. Control often disguises itself as confidence, until it begins slipping away. Then it usually looks like anger. What about your dad? Luke stared into his glass. He hasn't been saying much. Interesting. Very interesting. Richard had spent years avoiding conflict. Silence was his favorite hiding place. But silence changes. Meaning after the truth comes out. Before, it protects. Afterward, it exposes. Luke looked up. I found something. My attention sharpened immediately. What? He reached into his backpack, removed a folded piece of paper, then slid it across the table. I picked it up carefully. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A printed spreadsheet. Household expenses.
Notes.
Numbers. Then I noticed several highlighted entries. Kitchen renovation. Vacation fund. Emergency savings. Tuition reimbursement. My stomach tightened. Where did you get this? Luke looked uncomfortable. It was sitting on Mom's desk. I continued reading. Most of the numbers meant nothing. Until one column did. Projected educational surplus. Surplus. The word immediately caught my attention. I looked up. Luke already knew. That's what I thought too. Neither of us spoke. Because the implication was obvious. Someone expected money left over. Someone expected access. Someone had already planned for it. The room felt quieter suddenly. Outside, wind rustled through the backyard trees. Inside, a different kind of storm was forming. I looked back down at the spreadsheet. Several handwritten notes appeared beside the highlighted section. Future renovations.
Kitchen.
Bathroom. Potential investment. Family vacation. Not tuition. Not books. Not housing. Not education. Something cold settled inside my chest. Not shock. Confirmation. I thought about Martin, the trust, the direct payment structure, the protections Harold built into the system. Suddenly, I understood them much better. Luke looked miserable. I don't think she understood how the trust worked. I nodded slowly. Neither did I. Until recently. Which meant Vanessa likely believed there would be money passing through the family. Money available. Money accessible. Money useful. The realization connected too many pieces. Far too many. Luke rubbed his forehead. Grandma, his voice lowered. I think she was counting on it. The sentence lingered. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Painfully believable. I folded the paper carefully, then set it aside. For a moment, I thought about everything that had happened. The invitation. The exclusion. The comments. The control. The trust fund. Individually, each event looked small. Together, they formed a picture. And the picture wasn't flattering. Not at all. My phone buzzed. The timing startled both of us. I glanced at the screen. Martin Bell. Interesting. Very interesting. I answered immediately. Helen. His voice sounded calm. Professional.
Steady.
I wanted to let you know the paperwork has been completed. I sat up straighter. Luke watched me carefully. What paperwork? Martin didn't hesitate. The revised payment instructions. Relief washed through me. Quiet.
Deep. Permanent.
Everything moving forward will be paid directly to Ohio State. I closed my eyes briefly. Thank you, Harold. Not for the money.
For the foresight.
Martin continued.
No reimbursements. Good. No discretionary transfers.
Even better. No family access distributions.
Perfect.
Every possible opening closed. Every possible misunderstanding removed. Every possible temptation eliminated. The structure now reflected exactly what Harold intended. Education. Nothing else. When the call ended, I sat quietly for several moments. Luke finally broke the silence. It's done? I nodded. Yes. Something changed in his expression. Relief. Not because money had been protected, because uncertainty had been removed. The difference matters. People can handle bad news. What destroys them is uncertainty. For the first time in weeks, Luke seemed able to breathe normally. Then his face darkened again. What happens when Mom finds out? The question hung between us. Neither of us knew the answer. But deep down, I suspected it wouldn't be pleasant. Control rarely leaves quietly, especially when people believe something belongs to them, even when it never did. Later that afternoon, after Luke left, I found myself standing in Harold's study. The room remained mostly unchanged. His desk, his books, his reading lamp, his favorite chair. Time had moved forward. The room hadn't. I opened one of the desk drawers. Inside sat dozens of ordinary things. Pens, receipts, old photographs. Nothing remarkable. Then I found a yellow legal pad. Harold's handwriting covered several pages. Meeting notes, estate notes, financial reminders. I smiled sadly. My husband documented everything. Always had. One page near the back caught my attention. A short note written years earlier. Only one sentence.
No explanation.
No context. Just a reminder to himself. Make sure Luke's future never depends on anyone else's priorities. I stared at those words for a very long time, because suddenly they felt less like financial planning and more like protection. Protection from exactly this. The realization made my eyes sting unexpectedly. Not because Harold had predicted specific events. Because he understood people. Better than I did. Perhaps better than I wanted to. That evening, Richard called. His voice sounded exhausted. I need to tell you something. The sentence immediately got my attention. What is it? Several seconds passed. Then, Vanessa knows about the trust changes. I remained silent. Listening. Waiting. Richard exhaled heavily. She's furious. There it was. The reaction. Not sadness. Not embarrassment. Not regret. Fury. The response told me more than words ever could. If the graduation had truly been a misunderstanding, this wouldn't matter. If the exclusion had been accidental, this wouldn't matter. If everything had been about stress, this wouldn't matter. Yet somehow it mattered very much. Richard sounded defeated, almost hollow. Mom. I waited. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. I don't think she's upset about the money.
No.
His answer came quietly, painfully. I think she's upset because she can't control the outcome anymore. After we hung up, I sat alone in the darkened living room. The house felt peaceful, for the first time in weeks. Not because the problems were solved, because I finally understood them. The graduation was never about a seat. The invitation was never about a piece of mail. The trust wasn't really about money. At the center of everything sat something much simpler. Control. Who belongs? Who gets heard? Who matters? Who stays in the background? And for years, I had allowed other people to decide those things for me. Not anymore. Outside, the porch light clicked on automatically. The same timer Harold installed years ago.
I
Looked toward the framed graduation photo Luke had recently texted me. The one he wanted to print. The one where he stood beside me.
no slight smiles.
No performance. Just truth. A small smile finally appeared. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't revenge. Sometimes it's simply closing a door and realizing you no longer need permission to walk through another one. 8 months later, autumn arrived in Ohio. The maple tree beside my mailbox had turned brilliant shades of gold and red. Every morning, fallen leaves gathered across the driveway. Every morning, I swept them away. Some habits remain comforting no matter how much life changes. Others become reminders. This one was both. I stood on the front porch holding a cup of coffee while watching the neighborhood wake up around me. The air felt crisp,
Cool.
peaceful. For the first time in a very long time, peace no longer felt lonely. That surprised me, more than anything else. For years, I thought loneliness came from being alone. I understand differently now. Loneliness comes from sitting at a table full of people who no longer see you. That kind of loneliness is much harder to survive. Luke called every Sunday, without fail, usually around 4 in the afternoon. Sometimes from his dorm room. Sometimes while walking across campus. Sometimes from the student union while waiting for friends. The conversations weren't dramatic. Mostly ordinary things. Classes. Professors. Football games. Midterms. Laundry disasters. The normal details of a young man building a life. I treasured every one of them. Not because he owed me anything. Because they were real.
No manipulation. No obligation.
No performance. Just connection. The way family should feel. The framed graduation photograph sat on the bookshelf beside Harold's old coffee mug. In the picture, Luke stood beside me outside the gymnasium. His graduation gown slightly crooked. My hand resting on his shoulder. Neither of us smiling perfectly. Neither of us posing. It remained my favorite photograph. Because it told the truth. And after everything that happened, truth mattered more than perfection. Richard visited twice a month now. Sometimes more. Never.
Less.
The first few visits felt awkward. Painfully awkward. We were both trying to learn a new version of our relationship. One built on honesty instead of avoidance. That takes time. More time than people realize. One evening in October, we sat together on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. Neither of us spoke much. Eventually Richard sighed. You know. I waited. I still wish I could undo it. The statement wasn't specific. It didn't need to be. The graduation. Thanksgiving. The birthdays. The silences. All of it. I looked toward the yard. The roses had already been trimmed for winter. You can't. Richard nodded. I know. The sadness in his voice felt genuine.
Deep. Permanent.
Some mistakes become part of a person. Not because they can't be forgiven. Because they can't be erased. We sat quietly for several minutes. Then he said something that stayed with me. I spent years thinking keeping the peace made me a good husband. I turned toward him. Richard stared into the distance. It never occurred to me that it made me a bad son. Neither of us spoke after that. Sometimes truth arrives quietly. And once it arrives, nothing needs to be added. Vanessa never apologized. Not really. There were messages. Polite messages. Carefully written messages. The kind people send when they want conflict to disappear without addressing it. But never an apology. Never accountability. Never, I was wrong. At first, that bothered me. Eventually, it stopped. Because apologies only matter when they come from understanding. Not strategy. Not convenience. Not image management. One afternoon, Martha Green called while I was baking banana bread. Helen. Her voice carried its usual excitement. You'll never guess who quit book club. I laughed. The sound surprised me. I did that more often now.
No idea.
Vanessa. Apparently, several uncomfortable conversations had followed graduation. People had started asking questions. Questions she no longer controlled. Interesting how that works. Control disappears quickly once other people stop participating. After the call ended, I found myself thinking about something Martin Bell once said. Harold trusted your heart. He just worried other people might use it against you. For a long time, I interpreted those words as a warning. Now I understood them differently. Harold wasn't telling me to become harder. He was reminding me not to confuse kindness with surrender. The difference matters. More than most people realize. A few weeks before Thanksgiving, Luke came home for the weekend. He arrived carrying laundry and an appetite large enough to empty my refrigerator. Some things never change. We spent Saturday afternoon sorting through old family photo albums. Boxes and boxes of them. Decades of birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings, school plays.
Ordinar i moments.
The real history of a family. At one point, Luke held up a photograph from 20 years earlier. He couldn't have been more than 3. Harold sat beside him on the living room floor, both wearing matching dinosaur pajamas.
Luke laughed.
I forgot about these. I smiled. Your grandfather never did anything halfway. We turned pages for nearly an hour. Then Luke stopped. His expression softened. What? He handed me a photograph. It had been taken at Richard's high school graduation. Harold stood on one side. I stood on the other. Richard in the middle. All of us smiling. All of us together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Luke said quietly, Grandma? Yes. I'm glad you came to mine. The words hit harder than he intended. In the best possible way. I reached over and squeezed his hand. So am I. That night, after he left, I walked into the living room and stood in front of the bookshelf. The graduation photograph remained exactly where it always sat. Beside it rested something else. The invitation. The original one. Wrinkled. Folded. Slightly damaged. I had placed it inside a simple frame. Not because I wanted to remember the hurt. Because I wanted to remember the lesson. For years, I believed family love meant enduring anything. Excusing everything. Making myself smaller whenever necessary. The invitation taught me otherwise. I traced the edge of the frame gently, then looked at Harold's photograph nearby. You were right. The house remained silent. Comfortably silent. The kind of silence that no longer feels empty. Outside, leaves drifted across the yard. Inside, the framed invitation sat beside the graduation photograph. One represented exclusion. The other represented truth. Together, they told the entire story. Some wounds heal. Some don't. Some relationships recover. Others change forever. Richard and I were still rebuilding. Luke and I were closer than ever. Vanessa remained part of the family, but not the center of it. Not anymore. And perhaps that was the real ending. Not revenge. Not victory. Not punishment. Perspective. The day I stopped begging for a place at the table was the day I finally remembered something important. I had spent my entire life helping build that table. And no one had the right to convince me I didn't belong there.